The tour ends where it always ends. You shuffle out through the gift shop, past the refrigerator magnets and the paperback escape stories, and you carry with you a very specific picture of what Alcatraz was. A dramatic rock, a cold bay, a famous set of corridors where famous men once paced. You saw the dining hall. You saw Al Capone's cell. You heard the audio guide explain how the guards outnumbered the prisoners and how no one ever successfully escaped. It was a good tour. But you did not see D Block, not all of it. What the National Park Service shows visitors today is the public version of D Block. A row of cells on the west side of the cell house, some with their doors open, a recorded voice explaining the concept of solitary confinement. It is informative. It is well lit. It gives you just enough discomfort to feel like you've engaged with the difficult parts of the history. The actual experience of D Block. What happened in those cells, who ordered it, who survived it, and who didn't, is a different matter entirely. It's not hidden because anyone is embarrassed, exactly. It's more that the full story resists the 45-minute format. It requires sitting with things that don't resolve neatly. It requires understanding a system that was, by design, intended to produce a particular kind of psychological result in human beings, and then asking whether it worked, and then asking whether working was ever really the point. This is that story. It starts not with a cell, but with a principle. In 1934, when the federal government converted a military prison on a rock in San Francisco Bay into the United States Penitentiary at Alcatraz, the Bureau of Prisons was operating under a specific theory of criminal behavior. The theory, stripped to its essentials, was this: certain men were simply beyond rehabilitation. They were not criminals who had made wrong choices in bad circumstances. They were, in the language of the time, incorrigibles. The career criminal, the organized crime figure, the man who had already escaped from other federal prisons or who had proven himself capable of corrupting other inmates, suborning guards, or running operations from inside a cell. For these men, the standard federal prison, even a tough one, was not a sufficient environment. They needed a place that was specifically designed to offer nothing. No amenity that could be taken away as punishment, because the baseline itself would be the punishment. No outside contact that could be used as leverage. No institutional position that could be exploited. No path through the system at all, except the path back to another federal facility after a sufficient period of demonstrated compliance. Alcatraz was built around this principle. The rock was the first layer of control. The cold bay and the currents were the second. The structure of the cell house, tight, monitored, acoustically live, was the third. And D Block, the treatment unit, was the fourth. The layer beyond the layer. The place inside the place. James A. Johnston, the first warden of the federal penitentiary, had experience running San Quentin and Folsom, two of California's most difficult state prisons. He was not a cruel man in the ordinary sense. He believed genuinely in a structured environment as a corrective force. He also believed, and this is the part that matters, that the structure had to be total. Any crack in it, any moment of warmth, any allowance, any acknowledgement that the rules might bend, undermined the entire system. Johnston ran Alcatraz on that premise from 1934 until 1948. D Block was his primary instrument of last resort. Cell Block D was not identical to the isolation units in other federal prisons of the era, though it drew on the same tradition. It occupied the westernmost section of the main cell house building, a three-tiered structure of 42 cells arranged in the standard Bureau of Prisons configuration. The cells were roughly 5 feet wide and 9 feet deep. The walls were concrete. The doors were solid steel with a small slot at the bottom for food trays. There were gradations within D Block, and this is something the tourist version of history tends to flatten. Not everyone in D Block was in the same situation. Some men were in what was called close confinement. They were housed in D Block but had limited privileges. A book from the library, 1 hour of outdoor exercise per day in a small yard attached to the unit, occasional access to the main dining hall. These were men who had been moved to D block as a precautionary measure or were serving short disciplinary sentences for minor infractions. Below close confinement was segregation. Segregation meant the cell, the slot, and nothing else. No exercise. No books, initially, though this changed over time as pressure from outside inspectors mounted. No work assignment. No contact with other prisoners, except through walls. Food was brought 3 times a day. A guard walked the tier at regular intervals. Beyond that, time in segregation was measured in silence. And below segregation, there were the holes. The term "the hole" has been used so often in descriptions of American prisons that it has become almost abstract, a figure of speech for harsh treatment. In D block on Alcatraz, the hole was a specific physical space. There were 6 cells at the bottom tier of D block, cells 9 through 14, though different accounts number them slightly differently, that had been stripped of their regular furnishings and had their windows blocked or significantly reduced. These cells were darker than the rest. The concrete floor was bare. There was a toilet and a sink. There was a mattress that was brought in at night and removed in the morning, so that during daylight hours the cell contained nothing a man could lie down on. Men in the holes were kept in these conditions for varying lengths of time. Days, sometimes weeks. The record, as best can be reconstructed from surviving documentation and prisoner accounts, suggests some men spent more than a month in these cells. The psychological literature on what extended darkness and isolation do to the human brain was not unknown in the 1930s and 1940s. It simply was not considered a relevant objection. The population of D block at any given time during the Johnston years was not random. It was the product of a classification system that sorted for a particular type of institutional problem. The man who would not comply, not because of impulse or mental illness, but because he had decided, with apparent deliberation, that compliance was not something he owed the institution. Some of these men were there because of violence. Alcatraz's population included convicted killers, bank robbers who had shot federal agents, kidnappers. When they committed institutional offenses, assaulting guards, making weapons, attempting to organize collective resistance, they went to D block. But some of the most documented cases in D block's history involve something more complicated than violence. They involve men who went to D block because they refused to work, or because they filed grievances through improper channels, or because they spoke to other prisoners in ways the administration deemed subversive, or because they refused to be silent about conditions they considered unjust. Henry Young is a name that appears in almost every account of Alcatraz D block, partly because his case became the subject of a 1988 film, Murder in the First, which took considerable dramatic liberties but drew on a kernel of documented reality. Young was sent to Alcatraz in 1933 after a string of offenses, including robbery. He attempted to escape in 1939 along with several other prisoners. The attempt failed. Young was placed in isolation in D block. He remained there, in conditions that the subsequent court proceedings described in terms that alarmed even the judge, for a period of years. When Young was eventually returned to the general population, he killed another prisoner named Rufus McCain, who had, according to trial testimony, informed on the escape attempt. Young was tried for murder. His defense attorney, James McInnes, argued that the years in isolation had rendered Young unable to form criminal intent in the ordinary sense, and that the Bureau of Prisons bore a share of responsibility for what had happened in the general population. Yard. The jury acquitted Young of first-degree murder and convicted him of manslaughter. It was, for 1941, a remarkable outcome. The judge's remarks during sentencing were pointed. He observed that the conditions Young had been kept in were themselves a form of punishment that had not been sanctioned by any court, and that the Bureau of Prisons had been administering a sentence that went well beyond what any jury had authorized. Johnston disputed this characterization. He maintained until the end of his tenure that D Block was a necessary management tool for an institution housing the country's most dangerous federal prisoners. He was not wrong that the population of Alcatraz was difficult. He was not wrong that some form of disciplinary segregation was probably necessary. Whether what existed in D Block was proportionate to that necessity is a question the institution's administrators never fully engaged with. To understand what D Block meant as a daily reality, it helps to understand the broader physical logic of the Alcatraz cell house. Because D Block was not just a wing of cells, it was the endpoint of a system that was calibrated at every level to produce in its population a specific psychological state, one of total awareness that the institution was always watching, always present, and could at any moment deliver consequences from which there was no appeal. The main cell house contained 3 cell blocks, designated A, B, and C plus D block. Blocks B and C ran the length of the building in 2 parallel rows, back to back, separated by a utility corridor that could not be accessed from the cells themselves. Every cell in B and C faced another cell. This design was not accidental. It meant that from any cell in the main population, what you saw when you looked out through the bars was another set of bars looking back at you. The visual language of the building was one of enclosure reinforcing enclosure. The cell house floor was a material called Michigan, a rubberized compound that absorbed sound slightly, but more importantly, gave guards a consistent, readable surface to move across. The catwalks above the cell tiers were glass-fronted for part of their length, allowing an observer on the upper gallery to see down into the cells at angles that were not otherwise visible from the floor. The gun gallery, an enclosed corridor running along the outside wall, allowed an armed guard to cover the entire cell block without ever being physically accessible to the prisoners. The design drew on the panopticon principle. Build it so that anyone could always be watched, whether or not they actually were, and the population will internalize the watching. D Block sat at the end of this system. Its position was partly practical and partly symbolic. To be sent to D Block was to be sent to the wall. To go from D Block to the holes was to go through the wall entirely. There was nowhere further the institution could send you except outside it, and Alcatraz did not transfer men out as a disciplinary measure. It was the place you were sent when nowhere else wanted you. Several men who spent time in D Block during the Johnston and subsequent Swope eras wrote about it after their release. Their accounts differ in specifics, memory is imperfect, and the documents they had access to were limited. But they converge on certain details. The sounds, specifically. The cell house was a resonant space. Concrete and steel conduct sound unusually well, and the design of the building, the parallel rows, the high ceiling, the enclosed galleries, created an environment where noise traveled in ways that were difficult to locate or block. In the general population, this meant that the ambient sound level during the day was high. Voices, footsteps, the industrial grind of work details, the tinny sound of a radio playing somewhere. At night, the sounds changed but did not stop. Men snored, men talked in their sleep, men made sounds that had no name. You were never, in the main cell house, in silence. In D Block, particularly in the lower tier during disciplinary confinement, the acoustic experience was different. The solid doors dampened but did not eliminate sound. What came through the door was filtered, flattened, directionally ambiguous. You could hear things happening in the corridor, but not clearly enough to parse them. You could sometimes hear men in adjacent cells, but often not know if what you were hearing was actual speech or the building's own sounds. The expansion and contraction of metal in temperature changes, water moving in pipes, the footsteps of guards conducting rounds. Morton Sobel, who was sent to Alcatraz in 1952 following his conviction in the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg espionage case, wrote an account of his years on the island. Sobel spent time in D Block for institutional infractions and described the sensory quality of isolation in terms that were precise and unsparing. What he emphasized was not primarily the physical deprivation, though he documented that. What he emphasized was the cognitive work of maintaining a coherent sense of time and self in an environment that was specifically designed to offer no purchase for either. In darkness, without a clock, without a window, the internal sense of time begins to drift within hours. A man who goes into the hole at 2 in the afternoon may, by what feels like the following morning, have experienced what is actually 8 hours, or 30. The body's circadian system requires regular light cues to maintain its calibration. Remove them, and the system begins to run on internal rhythms alone, which are imprecise and idiosyncratic. Some men in the holes reported losing track of how long they had been there within the first day. Some reported experiencing what they described as waking dreams, vivid and realistic enough to be confused with actual events. No figure in the Alcatraz narrative has been more systematically mythologized than Robert Stroud, and no mythologized figure has had his Alcatraz experience more thoroughly sanitized. The 1962 film Birdman of Alcatraz, with Burt Lancaster in the title role, created an image of Stroud as a self-educated ornithologist who transformed himself through intellectual labor and was kept at Alcatraz out of bureaucratic spite. The film is not accurate in any consequential respect. Stroud came to Alcatraz in 1942, transferred from Leavenworth, where he had indeed kept birds and done the ornithological research that generated his 2 books on canary diseases. He was transferred specifically because the Bureau of Prisons had determined that his situation at Leavenworth, a private cell with birds, equipment, and considerable celebrity, had become unmanageable. He had, over 30 years at Leavenworth, developed an extensive network of correspondence with supporters, ornithologists, journalists, and, eventually, a woman named Della Mae Jones, whom he married by proxy in 1931. He was, in institutional terms, someone who had figured out how to be inside a federal prison and simultaneously maintain an identity and a set of relationships on the outside. This was precisely what Alcatraz was designed to prevent. At Alcatraz, Stroud was housed not in the general population, but in the hospital ward, a separate section of the cell house above the main blocks. He was old by then, in his early 50s, and in poor health. He did not have his birds. He was not permitted to continue his ornithological work. He spent his years at Alcatraz largely in isolation, writing a manuscript on federal prison systems that was confiscated by the Bureau of Prisons and not returned to him until years after his transfer out. What the Birdman narrative elides is that Stroud was at Alcatraz because he had killed a guard at Leavenworth in 1916, stabbed him to death in the dining room in front of 200 prisoners. He had been sentenced to hang for this. President Woodrow Wilson commuted the sentence to life in prison, reportedly in response to a personal appeal by Stroud's mother. Stroud was moved to solitary confinement for the killing and kept there in various configurations for the rest of his institutional life. The ornithology happened during that solitary confinement at Leavenworth. It was real, and it was genuinely remarkable as an example of intellectual effort maintained under severe restriction. But it was a permitted eccentricity, not a right, and it was terminated the moment the Bureau decided it had become a management problem. At Alcatraz, in the hospital ward, Stroud spent 17 years. He was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri in 1959, and died there in 1963, having spent 54 years in federal custody, the last 42 in some form of solitary confinement. He never experienced D-Block's isolation cells directly. But his story is useful context for understanding what D-Block was built to do, because the logic that kept Stroud in solitary for decades is the same logic that produced the holes in the lower tier. When Edwin Swope replaced Johnston as warden in 1948, the expectation among the prisoner population, an expectation that turned out to be partially correct and largely misleading was that conditions might soften. Johnston had run the institution for 14 years on strict principles that had generated persistent criticism from outside observers, including several federal judges and at least one congressional inquiry. Swope was a different administrative type. He was not without sympathy for the idea of rehabilitation. He made some changes to the program. He did not fundamentally alter D-Block. What changed under Swope was more procedural than structural. Disciplinary hearings became slightly more formalized. The criteria for placing a man in the lowest tier of D-Block were documented more carefully. The maximum continuous period a man could spend in the holes was, at least on paper, subject to review. None of this changed the basic physical reality of the cells, the darkness, the food slot, the mattress that arrived at night and left in the morning. It changed the paperwork around those things. Swope's tenure coincided with the most violent episode in Alcatraz's history, the Battle of Alcatraz in May 1946, which took place 2 years before Swope arrived and was therefore Johnston's crisis to manage, but whose aftermath shaped everything that followed. The battle began when a group of 6 prisoners led by Clarence Carnes, Sam Shockley, and Bernard Coy staged an escape attempt that succeeded in breaching the gun gallery and arming themselves with 2 rifles and 2 pistols. They took hostages. They attempted to reach a utility corridor that would have given them access to the exterior of the building, and discovered that a key they needed had been left in a lock and subsequently removed by a guard who had not understood its significance to the escape plan. The attempt stalled. Armed with military weapons, unable to proceed, they held the cell house for 2 days while the Army and Marines assaulted the building from outside and from the roof. When it ended, 2 guards were dead and 14 were wounded. 3 of the 6 prisoners were killed. Of the survivors, Shockley and Carnes and a 3rd man named Moran Thompson were tried for murder. Shockley and Thompson were executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin in December 1948. Carnes, who was 19 years old at the time of the battle and had reportedly helped some of the hostage guards survive, had his death sentence commuted to life. The aftermath of the battle shaped D-Block in specific ways. The Bureau of Prisons conducted an internal review of the security breach that had allowed Coy to access the gun gallery in the first place. He had used a homemade device to spread the bars of a ventilation space he'd identified as structurally weak, something that required months of quiet observation and preparation. The review concluded that the breach had been possible partly because institutional routines had become predictable, and that predictability had given a determined prisoner enough information to identify and exploit a single structural vulnerability. The response was to reduce predictability across the board. Guard rotations were changed. Counting procedures were revised. The physical structure of the gun gallery was reinforced. And the criteria for placement in D-Block were expanded to include any prisoner whom the administration had reason to believe was engaged in planning, even if no overt act had yet occurred. This was a significant shift. Before 1946, D-Block was primarily a consequence. After 1946, it became, in part, a precaution. The men who went to D-Block in the 1950s entered an institution that was already beginning to attract serious outside scrutiny. The post-war decade brought a different cultural context to questions about prisons and punishment. The Nuremberg trials had introduced into American public discourse a vocabulary around the treatment of prisoners and the limits of institutional authority that hadn't been there before. The emerging field of social psychiatry was producing research on the effects of prolonged isolation that made it harder to dismiss such conditions as merely uncomfortable. And Alcatraz, specifically, was beginning to generate a volume of complaint from prisoners, from their attorneys, from the few journalists and inspectors who gained access, that the Bureau of Prisons found increasingly difficult to manage publicly. One of the more significant visitors to Alcatraz during this period was James V. Bennett, the director of the Bureau of Prisons from 1937 to 1964. Bennett was not a reformer in any straightforward sense. He believed in the federal prison system and spent his career defending and expanding it. But he was also attuned to public perception in a way that the individual wardens who reported to him sometimes were not. His visits to Alcatraz were not investigative in any rigorous sense. He was not arriving to audit D Block or to interview prisoners about their conditions. He was arriving to assess the institution's overall operation and to form his own judgment about whether what was happening there was defensible. His correspondence from the period, portions of which are preserved in federal archives, suggests he was aware that D Block, as it operated in the mid-1950s, presented a problem. Not a legal problem necessarily, since the courts had been largely deferential to prison administrators on questions of internal discipline. A different kind of problem, one of proportionality, of what a democratic government could be seen to be doing to people in its custody. Bennett's concern was, to be direct about it, primarily strategic rather than moral. He was not writing letters expressing horror at the conditions in the holes. He was writing letters noting that continued adverse publicity about Alcatraz isolation practices would make it harder to defend the institution's budget in congressional appropriations hearings. This is worth being precise about. The critique of D Block that came from inside the federal system in the 1950s was not driven by a recognition that what was being done to prisoners was wrong. It was driven by a recognition that what was being done to prisoners was becoming a liability. The prisoner who most embodied this liability problem was Carroll Chessman, though Chessman's connection to Alcatraz is indirect. Chessman was held at San Quentin, not Alcatraz, and his case involved California state charges rather than federal ones. But he wrote prolifically from death row. 4 books in 8 years, all published to varying degrees of commercial and critical success, and his writing made the conditions of long-term imprisonment in California a subject of national and international attention, in a way that was not comfortable for any prison administrator in the late 1950s. Chessman was executed in 1960 after 12 years on death row, having exhausted every available legal avenue. But his books remained in print. They had established a template. The prisoner who could write well was a prisoner who could create public problems for the institution holding him. Alcatraz had its own version of this dynamic in the person of Alvin Karpis. Karpis was the last of J. Edgar Hoover's public enemies, a bank and train robber who had been arrested by Hoover personally in 1936, a fact that Hoover publicized extensively despite the credible suggestion that Hoover had not personally made the arrest so much as arrived after the fact to take credit for it. Karpis spent 25 years at Alcatraz, longer than anyone else. He was not primarily housed in D Block. He spent most of his time in the general population. But he experienced D Block's discipline system and wrote about it after his 1969 release in a memoir called On the Rock. His account of D Block was not the most lurid in the historical record, but it was among the most methodical. He described the gradations of punishment, the logic of the system, the particular character of isolation in the lower-tier cells. He was a precise observer, unsentimental about both his own conduct and the institution's. His book was not a bestseller, but it was quoted extensively in subsequent journalistic and academic accounts of Alcatraz. What Karpis observed, and what the historical record largely confirms, is that the disciplinary function of D Block was only partially about punishment in the conventional sense. It was also about information. A prisoner in D Block's lower tier was a prisoner who was receiving nothing from outside the cell. No news from the institution, no gossip from other prisoners, no sense of the rhythms and events of the general population. This informational deprivation had 2 effects. The obvious one was psychological. It increased anxiety, disorientation, and the feeling of helplessness. The less obvious one was strategic. When a man came out of the hole and back into the general population, he was behind. He didn't know who had been transferred in or out. He didn't know which guards had rotated. He didn't know the current dynamics among prisoner factions or what arrangements existed between whom. A man who had spent weeks in the hole was, on his return, temporarily in a position of informational vulnerability that could last days or weeks while he rebuilt his understanding of the current situation. This was not an accidental feature of the system. It was, in the view of some of the more operationally minded administrators, one of its primary benefits. The 1950s also brought to D Block a category of prisoner that the institution's founders had not particularly anticipated. Men held not for crimes of violence or career criminality, but for ideological offenses. Morton Sobel's arrival in 1952 was followed by that of other men convicted under the Espionage Act or related statutes during the early Cold War period. These men were not professional criminals. They were, in many cases, educated, politically sophisticated, and possessed of exactly the kind of capacity for sustained intellectual resistance that the Alcatraz system found most difficult to manage. Sobel, in particular, proved to be a systematic documentarian of his own incarceration. He kept mental notes with the deliberateness of someone who understood that he might eventually have an audience for them. His subsequent book, On Doing Time, published in 1974, is one of the most detailed first-person accounts of the Alcatraz disciplinary system in existence. Sobel's description of his own time in D Block is useful precisely because it is specific about things that other accounts treat vaguely. He describes the physical dimensions of the cell with the precision of someone who has measured it with his body. He describes the food not as a general complaint about institutional cooking, but as a specific account of what arrived through the slot and when, and what the experience of eating in darkness or near darkness was like. He describes the sounds he could distinguish and the sounds he could not, and what the uncertainty about which was which did to his concentration and his sleep. And he describes, in the most unsettling section of his account, the process of trying to maintain a practice of rational thought in an environment that seemed calibrated to make rational thought progressively more difficult. Not impossible, not immediately, but progressively, as if the environment were designed to wear thought down the way water wears stone, slowly, continuously, without visible effect until one day the stone is different. The Bureau of Prisons would have objected to this characterization. The official position was always that D Block was a disciplinary tool, not a psychological one. The distinction mattered institutionally because a disciplinary tool was within the traditional authority of prison administrators to deploy, while a psychological intervention implied a kind of medical or quasi-medical function that would have required different oversight, different documentation, different legal justification. By insisting that what happened in D Block was discipline, punishment for specific infractions, administered for a specific duration, reviewed periodically, the Bureau kept it within a framework that the courts were willing to defer to. Any suggestion that what was actually happening was the deliberate degradation of cognitive function through sensory manipulation would have moved the conversation into territory the Bureau did not want to occupy. The territory they did not want to occupy was, by the late 1950s, being mapped by researchers elsewhere. The experiments conducted by John Lilly and others on sensory deprivation in the mid-1950s, though focused primarily on flotation tank conditions rather than cell confinement, were generating results that made their way into mainstream publications. The basic finding that the human brain, deprived of external sensory input, begins to generate its own, with results ranging from mild perceptual distortion to florid hallucination, was not obscure by 1958. It appeared in Scientific American. It appeared in popular science publications. Anyone within the Bureau of Prisons who wanted to know what the research said about extended isolation in low-stimulation environments could find out without difficulty. Whether anyone looked is a different question. Whether looking would have changed anything is a different question still. In 1958, Paul Madigan replaced Swope as warden. Madigan had a reputation within the federal system as a pragmatist. He was less rigid than Johnston, less administratively remote than Swope. He was, by several accounts, including those of guards who served under him, genuinely interested in whether what Alcatraz was doing produced any useful result. Not useful in a rehabilitative sense. By 1958, even the most optimistic administrators had largely abandoned the idea that Alcatraz was going to rehabilitate anyone, but useful in the narrower institutional sense of whether the disciplinary system actually controlled behavior, or whether it simply created a population of men whose behavior was controlled while they were on the island and unpredictable once they left. Madigan's tenure coincided with two events that, taken together, forced a more direct confrontation with what D Block was doing than any previous administration had managed. The first was a series of formal complaints filed by prisoners through their attorneys that reached federal courts in the Northern District of California. These complaints were not primarily about D Block. They covered a range of grievances including mail censorship, restrictions on legal correspondence, and the denial of access to courts. But they established a pattern of judicial attention to Alcatraz that had not previously existed. The second event was a hunger strike in 1958 that involved a significant portion of the general population and resulted in a formal federal investigation. The investigation was not conducted by an adversarial body. It was conducted by people within the correctional system who were broadly sympathetic to the challenges of prison administration. But it produced a written record, and written records have a way of eventually becoming public. The hunger strike grew from conditions that had accumulated over years. The immediate trigger was a change in work assignment policies that prisoners experienced as arbitrary and retaliatory. But the depth of the response, the breadth of participation, the willingness of men to accept the consequences of a hunger strike, which included D Block, suggested that something had been building for a long time. When an institution is functioning as intended, its population does not, in significant numbers, accept escalated punishment as preferable to continued compliance. A mass hunger strike is a measurement of institutional failure, even if the measurement is unwelcome. The investigation that followed found, in careful bureaucratic language, that the disciplinary system at Alcatraz lacked certain procedural safeguards that had become standard in other federal facilities. Hearings were not consistently documented. The criteria for determining the duration of isolation were not applied uniformly. The review process for men in the lower tier of D Block, the holes, was not functioning as described in official policy. None of this was framed as a finding that the system was cruel or unconstitutional. It was framed as a finding that the system was inconsistent, and that inconsistency created management problems. What changed after the investigation was, again, primarily procedural. Documentation improved. Review timelines were formalized. The physical conditions in D Block's lower tier were not meaningfully altered, but the record of who was there, why, and for how long became more complete. This was, from the perspective of prisoners, not an improvement so much as a reorganization of the same system with better paperwork attached. From the perspective of the Bureau of Prisons, it was a meaningful reform that addressed the legitimate concerns raised by the investigation. Both assessments can be simultaneously true. The early 1960s brought the beginning of the end for Alcatraz as a federal penitentiary, though the institution itself didn't know it yet. The costs of maintaining a facility on an island in San Francisco Bay, where everything had to be brought in by boat, where the salt air accelerated the deterioration of every structure, where the water supply was insufficient and the sewage system was failing, were becoming impossible to justify. A report commissioned by Attorney General Robert Kennedy in 1962 found that the per-prisoner cost at Alcatraz was more than 3 times the average for other federal penitentiaries. The physical plant required extensive renovation that would cost more than building a new facility from scratch. The report was not primarily a critique of D-Block or the isolation system. It was a budget document. But budget documents, when they produce a clear enough number, become their own kind of argument. The closure was announced in 1963. The last prisoners were transferred in March of that year. The final prisoner to leave was Frank Weatherman, transferred to the federal penitentiary at McNeil Island in Washington State. There were 27 men still housed at Alcatraz on the day it closed. 27 men in a facility that had been built to hold 264 and had at its peak housed more than 300. The population had been declining for years as transfers outreduced numbers, and the Bureau became increasingly reluctant to send new prisoners to a facility it had already decided to close. The closure of Alcatraz did not close D-Block as a practice. The men who had been in D-Block were transferred to other facilities, some of which had their own isolation units. The techniques developed and refined at Alcatraz, the gradations of privilege, the use of complete sensory reduction as a disciplinary tool, the strategic management of information access were not specific to the island. They were institutional knowledge that traveled with the administrators and correctional officers who had worked there and moved on to other postings. The physical cells were unique. The system they embodied was not. The island sat empty for 6 years after the closure, which is its own strange chapter. The federal government wasn't sure what to do with it. Various proposals circulated: a monument, a shopping center, a space-age convention complex. In 1969, a group of Native American activists from a coalition called Indians of All Tribes occupied the island, invoking an 1868 Sioux Treaty provision that granted Native Americans rights to unused federal land. The occupation lasted 19 months. At its peak, it housed several hundred people. It ended in June 1971 when federal marshals removed the last holdouts, 15 people by that point, who had been on the island through increasingly difficult conditions as utilities and support were withdrawn. The occupation did not achieve its formal goals. The island was not transferred to Native American ownership, but it generated national attention to treaty rights and indigenous land claims in ways that had lasting effects on federal policy. The graffiti from the occupation, "Indians Welcome," painted in red on the water tower, is still visible on the island today. The National Park Service has preserved it. The National Park Service took over Alcatraz in 1973 as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The transition from federal prison to national park is stranger than it might sound. The buildings were not cleaned up or renovated for public consumption in any thoroughgoing way. The cells are largely as they were. The paint is the original paint, or what remains of it, after decades of bay air. The fixtures are the original fixtures. The gun gallery is closed to visitors, but visible. The dining hall, where guards once supervised 300 prisoners eating in near silence, now hosts audio tour visitors who can move through it at their own pace. D-Block is accessible to visitors. The tour enters from the main cell house corridor through a doorway at the end of the B and C block rows. The cells on the upper tiers are open. You can step inside one. The audio guide tells you about solitary confinement in the general terms described at the beginning of this account. A disciplinary measure, the removal of privileges, a tool for managing the most difficult prisoners. It tells you some of this. It does not tell you about the holes in the lower tier with any particular detail. It does not tell you how long men spent in them, or what the research on prolonged darkness and isolation says about what that duration does to a person, or what happened to Henry Young after his release, or what Morton Sobel wrote about the cognitive experience of being in those cells, or why Alvin Karpis considered the informational deprivation as significant as the physical. The tour is 45 minutes. Some things fit and some things don't. What fits? The dramatic setting, the famous prisoners, the escape attempts, the architecture. What requires more time? The question of what the institution was actually for, and whether it achieved it, and at what cost to the men inside it. The Bureau of Prisons' own records, many of which became accessible through Freedom of Information Act requests in the years following the closure, document conditions in D Block that are more detailed than anything the tour conveys. They include disciplinary logs listing the infraction, the placement, the duration, and the periodic reviews of men in the holes. They include medical reports on prisoners who were observed to be in deteriorating psychological condition during or after isolation. They include correspondence between wardens and the Bureau's central office in Washington discussing specific cases. And they include, in several instances, notes from Bennett and other senior administrators indicating awareness of the gap between what the official policy described and what the actual practice was. The official policy said that isolation in the lower tier was a short-term measure subject to regular review. The records document cases where men spent months in conditions that the policy did not contemplate. None of this documentation was secret in the sense of being deliberately concealed. It was simply institutional record-keeping that lived in filing cabinets in federal archives and was not particularly sought after until journalists and historians began looking for it in the 1970s and 1980s. The archival picture of D Block that emerges from this research is not the picture that the tour presents, and it is not the picture that the popular cultural version of Alcatraz, the films, the paperbacks, the refrigerator magnets, conveys. It is a more specific, more troubling, and more accurate picture. The specific thing that makes it troubling is not the existence of isolation cells. Prisons have had isolation cells as long as there have been prisons. The troubling thing is the gap between the institutional rationale and the institutional reality. The rationale was always behavioral. This is a tool for managing specific behaviors, applied proportionately, reviewed regularly, administered within clear limits. The reality, as the records show, was that the tool was applied inconsistently, that the reviews were often perfunctory, that the limits were violated in documented cases, and that the effects on the men subjected to it went beyond any behavioral modification that could plausibly be described as the goal. What was the goal, then? This is the question that the D Block records, read carefully, circle without resolving. There is evidence that some administrators believed the isolation system produced genuine compliance, that men who went through D Block came out more willing to follow institutional rules than they had been before. There is also evidence in the behavioral records of the same men that this belief was not consistently supported by what actually happened. Men came out of D Block and returned to exactly the conduct that had put them there. Some came out in worse behavioral condition than they went in, more volatile, less able to function in the general population, more likely to commit the kinds of offenses that would send them back. The possibility that the system was not producing the results it claimed to produce was not a comfortable one for the institution to examine, because examining it would have required either changing the system or acknowledging that it was being maintained for reasons other than those stated. Neither option was administratively convenient. It was simpler to continue the system, document it more carefully when under scrutiny, and attribute failures to the particular recalcitrance of particular prisoners rather than to any insufficiency in the approach itself. This pattern, the gap between institutional rationale and institutional reality, the documentation that reveals the gap, the administrative response that closes the gap on paper without changing it in practice, is not unique to Alcatraz. It appears in the history of virtually every American penal institution of the same era. What makes Alcatraz particular is the concentration. The island setting meant there was nowhere to go. The extreme security meant the population was selected for the men the system found most difficult to manage. The closure and subsequent historical attention meant the records were examined more thoroughly than those of institutions still in operation. The result is a case study in a specific institutional failure that is more legible than most, precisely because it is so well documented. The men who were in D Block's lower-tier cells during the 2.5 decades the federal penitentiary operated are, almost all of them, dead now. Some died in the institution, of natural causes, of violence, of suicide. Some were transferred out and served additional decades in other facilities. A handful were released and tried to rebuild lives in the world outside. Their accounts, where they exist, share a quality that is difficult to name, but that you notice when you read enough of them. A particular precision about physical detail combined with a particular vagueness about time. They remember the texture of the concrete, the temperature of the cell at night, the sound of footsteps in the corridor, the weight of the mattress being slid through the slot. They do not always remember exactly how long things lasted, or in what order certain events occurred, or which year a particular thing happened. This is consistent with what is now known about how prolonged isolation and sensory reduction affect memory encoding. The mechanism is not mysterious. Memory consolidation requires sleep, and sleep in those conditions was often severely disrupted. It also requires the kind of contextual cues, conversations, events, sequences that isolation specifically removes. Without those cues, individual experiences float free of temporal anchor. They remain vivid but undated. The tour guide on the island today, if you ask about D Block's worst cells, will tell you they were called the hole and that conditions were severe. If you ask what severe means specifically, the answer tends to remain general. The physical fact of the cells is right there. You can see the lower tier, the heavy doors, the blocked windows. The experiential fact of what those cells meant to the men inside them requires a different kind of attention. It requires the records, and the memoirs, and the court documents, and the research, and the willingness to hold all of it together without resolving it into something cleaner than it is. Alcatraz closed because it was too expensive to run, not because of D Block, not because of what happened in the holes, not because of Henry Young or Morton Sobel or the men whose names appear only as case numbers in disciplinary logs that no journalist ever sought and no filmmaker ever found. The institution ended for budgetary reasons, which is perhaps the most deflating possible conclusion to a story with this much dramatic material in it. The island became a park, the cells became a tourist attraction. The audio guide filled in the spaces where direct experience used to be. The holes in D Block's lower tier are still there. The doors are closed. You can look through a small window in each one and see the interior. Concrete, darkness, the outline of a floor drain. The audio guide does not stop there. The tour moves on. What you make of the rooms you didn't fully see, that's the part nobody hands you on the way out.